I'm going to go ahead and start us off by welcoming everybody to our webinar. My name is Laura Haas. I'm the Dean of the College of Information and Computer Sciences at UMass Amherst. Today's webinar is Fixing Social Media with Ethan Zuckerman. This webinar is part of our year-long series, Computing and Social Justice, which brings CICS researchers and the public together to critically assess how computing innovation intersects with vitally important issues like racism and bias, civic participation, economic inequality, and citizen privacy. Each webinar focuses on a different technology or application whose impact on society is extraordinary in ways that are both visible and invisible to the public. Today's talk is the second part of an exploration titled How to Fix Social Media and Civic Life and Everything Else, jointly presented with our partners, the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at UMass Amherst. In Tuesday's talk, Losing Trust, Taking Action, Ethan examined how democracies are suffering from a crisis of mistrust in institutions, from the government to the media, and what social change strategies are effective in this environment. In today's talk, Fixing Social Media, Ethan will explore how, instead of aspiring to fix social networks like Facebook, we could build new tools that support our ability to be good neighbors and good citizens. What would social networks look like if their goal was not maximizing shareholder profit, but strengthening democracy? Could publicly funded social media be designed around civic values and social change? A Q&A will follow Ethan's talk, but please feel free to ask questions at any time using the Q&A link at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to them when the talk is over. Ethan likes a short introduction, and many of you likely heard the lovely intro by Professor Jane Fountain of the School of Public Policy on Tuesday, so I will keep this brief. But for those who don't know him, Ethan Zuckerman is Associate Professor of Public Policy, Communication, and Information at UMass Amherst and Director of the Institute for Digital Public Infrastructure. His research focuses on the use of media as a tool for social change, the use of new media technologies by activists, and alternative business and governance models for the internet. He is the author of Mistrust, How Losing Trust in Institutions Provides Tools to Transform Them, and of Rewire, Digital Cosmopolitans in the Age of Connection. Previously, Zuckerman directed the Center for Civic Media at MIT and taught at the MIT Media Lab. In addition to authoring numerous academic articles, Professor Zuckerman is a frequent contributor to media outlets such as The Atlantic, Wired, and CNN. He received his bachelor's degree from Williams College and as a Fulbright scholar, studied at the University of Ghana. He and his family live in Berkshire County in Western Massachusetts. I am delighted to welcome Ethan Zuckerman.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here. And thank you, Laura, for that generous introduction. And thank you for all of you who are coming back from last time. And I promise for those of you who are just able to join this talk, that I will start this talk by giving you a little bit of what we covered in the last talk. You will not get left behind. I also promise that by the end of this talk, I will address the sheer ambition of the title for all of this. I'm very grateful to my friends at UMass for giving me the chance to put forward something this ambitious and crazy. And I'm aware of just how crazy and ambitious this is, and actually think it's enormously important to think on these sorts of scales, even if we fall short of what our goals are. But let me start by sort of recapping very, very briefly what I talked about on Tuesday. I shared the book that I've recently written called Mistrust. The basic thesis of the book is that trust in institutions, which is to say anything that is not really sort of governed by personalities, but is really governed by rules and bureaucracies, anything without a face, trust in institutions is falling very sharply in the US and in many other advanced democracies. There's a lot of reasons behind it. It likely has a lot to do with some very broad socioeconomic trends, including rising inequality, as well as improved education. But it also has a lot to do with specific institutional failures. When we fail to handle a crisis like coronavirus, we end up losing confidence in some of the systems involved. The main message that came out of that talk was that we as individuals and groups aren't helpless in the face of that shift. But what we do have to do is get out of the habit of assuming that social institutions are going to save us. We actually have to take seriously this idea that some of these institutions might need radical reform or might need to be eliminated and replaced with something else entirely. So that gets us sort of up to date. And what I ended up promising people at the end of that talk was that I wanted to talk about the institution that I am really most interested in addressing and reforming right now, which is the institution of social media. Now, it's not hard to find articles online talking about the various dangers of social media. I've borrowed this illustration here from a recent piece that I highly recommend. It's called Making Sense of the Facebook Menace by my friend Siva Vaidyanathan. And Siva's piece, looks at the many different things that might be problematic about Facebook and other social networks. But I want to sort of expand that critique further out and kind of talk about the worries that I think a lot of us are having about social media and what it might be doing to us and to society as a whole. So I'm going to argue that there's 5 sort of arguments that end up coming up about social media that we see recur fairly often. The first is this argument that social media is probably harming us individually. We have folk like Tristan Harris, who is directly above my head right now, who make the argument that social media is designed to be addictive. It's designed to keep us clicking. It uses all sorts of dark patterns to keep us scrolling even when we would want to move away from it, and that we should be deeply suspicious of the ways in which the technology has been designed to manipulate us. Sherry Turkle, who's an incredibly thoughtful critic of technology, wrote a book in 2011 called Alone Together, where she argued that social media use may in fact be making us lonelier, maybe making it harder for us to relate to each other in traditional offline contexts. And she argues that these online interactions are shallow, they're superficial, they're not as real or as deep as those offline interactions. So that's sort of one critique. A second critique, which I think is actually very hard to deny, is that social media is helping pull revenue away from journalism. This graph here looks at revenue for US newspapers. You can watch a decline over time. Google's revenue comes up. Google is, of course, a social media company through YouTube. They also are highly involved with the online advertising business along with Facebook. They are probably the 2 companies that have experienced all the new growth in online revenue. And you can see in things like Australia's threats to charge Google and Facebook for news content, this real fear that journalism is dying, social media has something to do with it, and we should find some way to pull money back from the social media platforms and ensure that we still have high quality journalism. I think these next 3 arguments are the ones that I honestly spend the most time on in my work. There's a lot of speculation that social media is changing the nature of our conversations online, that it's making us more polarized. If you lean towards the right, now you lean further towards the right. If you lean towards the left, now you lean further towards the left. There's an argument that echo chambers that are created within social media are leading us to more extremes and making it harder to understand other people's points of view. That was an argument elegantly made by my friend Eli Pariser in a very successful book called The Filter Bubble. right now, and particularly in the wake of what happened at the Capitol on January 6th, there is real concern that social media is being used to recruit extremists, and that people are falling down rabbit holes on YouTube or any number of other platforms and finding themselves radicalized by the content that they are encountering. This is an article that I teach within my class, Fixing Social Media, called What Happened After My 13-Year-Old Son Joined the Alt-Right. One of the most amazing things that came out in discussing it is that one of my students argued that the article itself was not real, and that we should be suspicious of its origins. And that takes me to maybe my biggest worry around social media the last couple of years, which is that it seems like social media may be part of the fragmentation of sort of a shared reality itself. One of the reasons that America seems like such a strange place to live right now and such a difficult place to govern is that there isn't actually a lot of agreement on a common set of facts and on sort of a common reality. And in fact, you can sort of unpack the January 6th riot in that way. You have people acting because they firmly believe that an election was stolen, and they believe that because some combination of political and media ecosystem has given them a reality that's somewhat different from the reality that I end up living within. So is social media bad for individuals? Is it bad for society as a whole? I want to give you a carefully considered scholarly answer to that, which is I don't know. And I don't know, not because I'm not interested in answering that question, but because it's really hard. One of the reasons it's really hard is that right now a lot of these critiques sort of have one or two problems to them. They're coming out of activist media, well meant, but very much playing with a framework that you might think of as techno-panic. It's a framework that looks at real social problems, things like polarization and ideological isolation, which is something that, to be honest, has been on the rise in American politics since the 1980s. And it then attributes it to technology. And so it's not so much the underlying issue that is incorrect, it's the attribution that might end up being incorrect. So absolutely, polarization is on the rise. Is it social media that's doing it? That's much harder to know. And in fact, there's good reasons to believe that social media is simply continuing trends that started in traditional media like cable television. Another problem that's sort of coming out in all of this is what we might call anecdata. And Eli, I think, would admit that some of what happens in the filter bubble is anecdata. His TED talk and sort of his opening example in his book is about an N of 3 experiment. He sort of asks 3 friends to try searching for something on Google and ends up getting different data. There's now been some scholarly research done in the filter bubble, and what it's largely found is that absolutely people do end up reading more content from people that they agree with, but it's more a function of the fact that most people are friends with people that they agree with. And social networks tend to give you content from your friends, and you tend to be friends with people who share your beliefs. That, more than the algorithm, seems to be having a big effect on what's going on. So put aside for the moment the fact that some of these feelings are technopanic, some of them are anecdata. Another problem is that once we start doing very big studies, what we find is very small effects. So this is one of the most careful and rigorous studies that's actually been done on adolescents' well-being and digital technology use. And what the authors here ended up doing was taking 3 sort of massive studies, putting them together, running the data again. And what they basically found, looking at the responses from more than 120,000 high school students, is that there is a small negative association between heavy social media use and unhappiness. So there's a small indication that if you're a heavy social media user, you may be more unhappy than average. There's no causality in this, by the way, right? You might be using more social media because you are slightly unhappier. They don't look at that arrow of direction in these studies. What's interesting is the size of the effect. So people as adolescents tend to be more unhappy if they wear glasses, as it turns out. And wearing glasses growing up or being short growing up is a significantly larger effect towards happiness than heavy social media use. In fact, the closest correlate, the closest size of effect to heavy social media use is eating a diet heavy in potatoes. So if you are a young person and you're a heavy social media user, you are probably that much likely to be unhappy as if you're eating a lot of French fries. We're not seeing a lot of social movements right now to ban potatoes or to ban French fries. These studies are uncommon. And frankly, highly rigorous quantitative studies are really uncommon because it's really hard to get data out of these platforms. Facebook and Twitter and YouTube are not big fans of handing over big data sets. Sometimes they have completely legitimate reasons not to hand over this data. There are real concerns about privacy. But what it means is that we are still in the field trying to figure out how to get the data we need to answer those big questions of whether social media is harmful for us as individuals or especially for a society. Actually, I just released this report with my colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Hansen Shapiro down at Columbia, which is a report for the nonprofit technology field about different ways to get data sets out of the large social media providers so that we can study these questions. And so for people who are interested in that, that may prove an interesting resource. But what I want to return to is this sort of question, is social media bad for us? I don't know. But if it is bad for us, we really shouldn't be surprised, right? And the reason we shouldn't be surprised is that there's no moment in the design of current social media platforms where we sort of ask the question, how could social media be good for society? The design moment is really about how do we create a tool that is usable by billions of people? And that has a lot to do with the ambitions of the founders of these platforms. It has an enormous amount to do with the financing that makes these platforms happen, the venture capital model. It has more than anything to do with this model that Shoshana Zuboff has identified as surveillance capitalism. This seems to be the term that we've agreed we're going to use to understand this field. Surveillance capitalism is this idea that if you're not paying for something, you are not a consumer, you're actually the product. And you are being measured and surveilled and packaged to be served in one fashion or another to the advertisers who want to reach you. And Zuboff looks at the emergence of this model. She looks at some of the dangers of this model. But it is worth noting that this is absolutely the dominant model that underlies social media in our world right now. Social media platforms almost invariably are open to everyone. They are seeking extremely high growth. They are free to use because they are subsidized by advertising. They collect a great deal of data on their users, and they use the collection of that data to justify higher ad prices. So the idea is, because on Facebook, you can see that I'm mostly friends with people in Western Massachusetts, and that a lot of my friends seem to be in their 40s and 50s, I am likely a middle-aged Western Massachusetts guy, and you can advertise to me accordingly. And Zuboff goes on to argue that this is corrosive in all sorts of ways. I think one of the ways that people are really noting that this is dangerous is that it may give social media platforms distorted incentives towards what they amplify. So there's been an observation that discussions on social media often seem to get angry, they often seem to get highly emotional. And one of the things that is theorized, and let me say theorized, right? Again, hard to study without data within the platform. One of the things that's theorized is that algorithms are amplifying content that get a lot of people to react, that get a lot of people to share it. And angry content, sad content, content with heavy emotional valence is the content that does the best. The danger there is that that perhaps becomes a system that amplifies misinformation. It amplifies misinformative and manipulative content. All of these things are things that people are now asking the question, could we fix that? And what I want to suggest is that that's the wrong question. I think it's fine to ask if we can fix Facebook, but I think it's way too small a question. If existing social media is failing to provide us with spaces that help us be good citizens, good neighbors, good friends to one another, good participants in a democracy, we run the danger of compounding that failure, a market failure, basically, with a failure of imagination. We are not doing the work to imagine and build social media that might work differently. So I want to go back in history to sort of talk about this idea that the way that a platform like Facebook works, where it's for everybody, it costs nothing, it tracks you, and it's paid for by advertisers, that's not in fact an inevitable model. And to do that, I actually want to go pretty far back. I want to go back to the 19 teens and the 1920s. And one of the things that I find fascinating about this period, I've been reading and writing about this period a lot lately. One of the things that I find astounding is the speed of it. So radio sweeps the world incredibly quickly, much, much faster than the internet sweeps the world. So transmitting music and spoken voice over radio is simply not possible before 1912. Someone figures out how to use a vacuum tube to build a voice amplifier in 1912. And by 1922, the basic model of commercial radio is established. We took a much, much longer time on the internet. We have packet switching networks in 1969. The first internet packets are flowing. It's 29 years before we have the real sort of commercial revolution with Google. In fact, what's kind of amazing is all of this radio gear, wireless gear, gear used to send dots and dashes during World War I, gets repurposed, gets attached to these tube amplifiers, and becomes the architecture behind these radio stations like WOR there in New York City, still in its same call letters 100 years later. But the thing that really blows me away is that you actually end up with three completely different models for what radio could be within this sort of period of 10 years. So in the US, radio starts really diverse. Everybody starts a radio station. If you're a college or a high school, you start a radio station. If you're a church, you start a radio station. Some of the most popular radio stations are being run by department stores. They're using them as a way of marketing radio sets. Hotels often run radio stations because they have live orchestras in their ballrooms, and then they put a microphone in front of them, and now you have radio. But by the mid 1920s, we hit this idea of advertising as the main model. And it's put together by AT&T, it's put together by the phone company. What they realize is that you can let someone call in on the phone, and then you can put it on the radio and you can advertise to a huge audience. And that is so successful that it pretty much stamps out a lot of the other markets out there very, very quickly. Now, at the same time that the US is doing this, the USSR, just formed after the end of World War I, does something entirely different with radio. They make radios not designed for household use. In fact, at first, radio shows up mostly in factories. It shows up in public squares. It's an amazing tool for convincing illiterate peasants how happy they are that they are now living under communism. When you do get consumer radios around the 1930s, they have a very elegantly simple design. You'll notice they have one knob on them. That's because there are no other stations. You just need to have it louder or quieter or off, comrade. So that's a very, very different system than what we see in the US. And when people think of state-controlled media, that's usually what they think of. What's most amazing is that in the UK, they come up with something entirely different. The UK looks at what's going on in the US. They look at, hundreds of stations springing up, and they say, this is crazy. We can't do it. They invite all of the early radio pioneers to sit down, and they jointly invent something called public broadcasting. And they tax radio sets, they hire a bunch of people to create content to edify and educate the population. And you could imagine this going very, very badly. But in fact, what's really interesting is it very quickly ends up being a force that can actually hold the government to account. There's a big labor strike in Britain shortly after the BBC goes on air. And not only does the Prime Minister go on the BBC, so does a labor leader. And that's really the first time in history that people are hearing opposition politicians speak. It gives the BBC a lot of credit, and this notion that you could have an entirely different model. So the first point that I want to make is that it's not inevitable that we end up with Facebook and surveillance capitalism. You can end up with very different things that happen when a new technology gets introduced. I also want to make the case that just because history's happened one way doesn't mean you can't change your mind. So Newt Minow takes over as the commissioner of the FCC in 1961. He's a personal friend of John F. Kennedy's. People are terrified about what he's going to do. And his first speech to the Broadcasters Association of America scares people witless, because Minow starts looking at what's on television, and a lot of it is soft entertainment. It's I Love Lucy, it's Gilligan's Island. And Minow basically says, look, this medium could be so much, it could do so much for the people. And instead, if you sit down and watch a day's worth of television, what you will see is a vast wasteland. And the National Association of Broadcasters is so shaken up by this, they are really worried that Minow is going to start banning certain types of television. In fact, there's an Easter egg in this image here. If you'll note, the ship that runs aground in Gilligan's Island is the SS Minnow. That is not a coincidence. That is a Newt Minow reference. What Minow does, though, is he doesn't take Gilligan's Island off the air. Instead, what he actually starts doing is saying, what if we had a parallel system? What if we had a system that strengthens us where the market isn't already strong? And those might be public interest broadcasting, and it should particularly be children's broadcasting. And so you start seeing research through Children's Television Workshop. How could television be used as a medium for education? You see the birth of NPR and the birth of PBS. And so these come around as a way of correcting a market failure, right? The market floods in to provide us with lots of Gilligan's Island, but it doesn't provide us with some of the things that we need. And so what I'm now really asking is, can we find a way to build a bridge with social media from Gilligan's Island, which frankly we have plenty of, to something that's a little closer to Sesame Street? So in other words, can we imagine, and then can we ultimately build new social media platforms that are plural in purpose? You don't just have to use them for one thing. They might have different rules for different communities. Can you build it so that it's public in spirit? It actually has an intentional goal of creating healthier communities. And then finally, can it train us to be better small d Democrats? Can it actually train us in civic participation through actually governing these networks? So I believe it can, in part because we've seen these networks emerge. One of my heroes in the space is this wonderful Bahraini activist named Ezra Al-Shafei. The work that she does in the Gulf is so dangerous that she actually doesn't publish her photo. She goes by this wonderful cartoon. But one of the many projects she started is a space called Awa. It is an anonymous digital space to discuss queer issues in the Middle East. And of course, it has to be anonymous, right? In the countries that she's operating this, notably Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, it would be enormously dangerous for people to be sharing their faces. And so Awa doesn't allow you to post a photo. Instead, you end up with an avatar of yourself. You need to be invited to join the community. And then you need to demonstrate that you're a successful participant in conversations for a while before Awa actually lets you open the thread. No one is saying that that's the way that all social media networks should work. But if you're dealing with queer youth in the Persian Gulf, of course that's how social media might have to work. So it doesn't make sense to have a Facebook or a Twitter with one set of rules that work for all instances. You actually need the capability of doing very, very different things with social media for very, very different communities. So here's another inspiration of mine from the Middle East. This is Wile Gonim. Really interesting guy. He was the Google employee who actually started the We Are All Khaled Saeed Facebook group, which ended up being the main rallying point for the anti-Mubarak demonstrations that ended up being known as the Arab Spring, and ended up literally overthrowing the Egyptian government. Gonim was incredibly frustrated by the fact that the tool, Facebook, that he used to such great effect to get people out in the street turned out to be a terrible tool to sort of plan Egypt's future. And he ended up building a network called Parlio that had really strong ground rules around civility. You could be thrown off simply for being uncivil, and you had to agree to this code of civility. It also was not trying to serve everyone. It was trying to serve a small network. His ambition was maybe 100,000 sort of social change makers and political leaders. But it was a really interesting example of a network that had a very strong pro-civic orientation. While Awa is still running, Parlio actually got absorbed into Quora. It is no more, but it's a nice example of some of what we're sort of trying to do with these ideas. Finally, when we talk about this question of governance, we actually have inspiration in a really unlikely place, Reddit, which is a network that people sort of love to hate. They often look at it with a great deal of fear because some of the communities on Reddit can be quite toxic. Many of them, though, are quite successful. They're very carefully moderated. And in fact, there are volunteer moderators that spend hundreds of hours trying to keep those communities clean and honest. One of the most remarkable is r/science, where you can really only participate in the discussion by citing peer-reviewed research. There's more than 1,000 moderators that participate to keep it going. My dear friend Nate Matthias over at Cornell has actually been studying Reddit moderation and experiments in these communities to sort of think about governance. And I think it's really worth thinking about this idea that participating in communities like this, where it's not just your job to show up and speak on a network, but it might be your job to serve. You might need to act as a moderator. You might be involved with the discussions of how a community is actually governed. Think about just how different that is from Facebook right now. Facebook has a 3-ring binder used by someone in the Philippines to figure out whether or not someone should be able to say something. You're not involved with that conversation. On Reddit and on the sorts of communities that I'm talking about building, you would be. And in fact, it would be sort of part of a very practical civics education. It would be the sort of lesson that you are getting in how difficult it is to maintain a conversation and sort of moderate a discussion. The architecture for this is small, distributed communities, but the idea would be that you would want to be able to participate in all of them at the same time. So this might mean that you have a single client on your phone or on your web browser that lets you interact with, a social network for your local coffee shop, or one associated with a community network, or maybe one that happens around the town meeting in your town. But we know that you're going to forget about that, the other parts of the year that the town meeting isn't happening. So that tool also allows you to interact with Facebook and to interact with Twitter and other networks. And it gives you stronger tools to use those networks and to sort of mediate your experience on them. There are some common infrastructures you have to do to build this. You need a single sign-on that's not controlled by Facebook or Google. You need protocols that these different networks can speak. There are some safety resources, ways of filtering out known dangerous content that you probably need to make available. But we're starting to build these things. I actually started building a first client for this over at MIT called Gobo. You can find it at gobo.social. What Gobo let you do was look at Twitter and Facebook and Mastodon, an open social network at the same time. And then you could filter things in and out of it. You had sliders for things like seriousness. I just want to see funny stuff, or I just want to see serious stuff. I want to see more voices of women. I want to hear from fewer men. Give me something from outside of my political sphere. These were all things that we built into Gobo. I'm now bringing Gobo over to UMass, where we're going to try to radically expand it and make it work with this new category of social networks, as well as a much broader swath of existing social networks. How do you fund all of this? Well, this is where this gets really crazy. Paul Romer, a Nobel-winning economist, has suggested that we probably need to start taxing surveillance advertising as a way of encouraging people to move away from it as a business model. He takes seriously Zuboff's critiques. He takes seriously this idea that this is not particularly good for users. It's not a very good deal, and wants to think about a tax as a penalty. I want to think about that tax as a revenue stream. I want a way of funding Sesame Street and funding Children's Television Workshop. Right now, Google and Facebook alone are making about $61 billion a year off of surveillance advertising. You put a 1% tax on that, you start generating an amazing pot of money that could be used to experiment around this. In fact, that pot of money is larger than the existing charitable spending of sort of the large projects that are trying to create these new digital public infrastructures, these new tools that are open, decentralized, scalable, governed by the people who use them. At this point in the talk, someone has usually brought up this question. It may already be in the chat, but I thought I would address it explicitly. I may be nuts, but there's some other people who are nuts as well. Even before I started working on this in the US, there's a great network in the Netherlands called Public Spaces that was trying to bring together Dutch public broadcasters and cultural institutions to stop using closed source surveillance US-based social media tools and instead build their own. I'm speaking at a conference they're hosting next week. They're still very active and they develop software around this. We're starting to see new social networks come up, and they're founded by interesting people. Wikitribune, which is designed to be a serious conversation social network, is being founded by Jimmy Wales, the guy who founded Wikipedia. And he's trying it as an experiment in a radically different non-ad supported social network. Tim Berners-Lee, the founder of the web, is starting a new architecture called Solid, which is a way of building websites that are compatible, but are also privacy preserving. And he's trying to move in a direction very compatible with the sorts of directions that I'm talking about here. I'm trying to bring a very ambitious vision for this over to UMass. It's a vision that's not just technical. Not only do we need to think about new social networks and an aggregator that can let you cross them, it's very involved with communities. The hope is that these networks are initially involving 20 to 2,000 people, real world communities, the sort of small communities that happen organically, and that they're meeting those sorts of community needs. And that's where a lot of this research is starting. But it's also a legal and policy project, which is in part why I'm splitting my time between CICS and SPP and the comm department, because there's all sorts of legal and policy changes that you need to sort of make this vision possible. And I want to sort of close with this notion of craziness by pointing people to the parachute that helped NASA's recent rover descend to the surface of Mars. And many of you have heard this story, but for those who haven't, many people commented on this weird asymmetrical parachute design. And people's observation at first was that you actually want it to be asymmetrical. That way you can figure out, is it unfurling properly? Is it working properly? You don't get worried about rotation. But it's also been discovered that, in fact, there's a binary message encoded in here. And the binary message says, "Dare mighty things." And I think one of the things that I really worry about in the space of the contemporary internet is that we may be forgetting to dare mighty things. There is a sense in which YouTube and Facebook and the sort of ambition on that scale has been ceded to venture capital. It's come out of academia, but it's no longer our problem. These are huge businesses. Who would dare to compete with them? I actually think it's enormously important that we find ways to look at the ways that these institutions fall short and think about how we dare mighty things to try to fix them and make them better. So with that, I'd love to have a conversation about that. I hope that is ambitious and crazy enough to live up to the title. And I'm so grateful for the chance to talk with all of you about this.
Thank you so much, Ethan, for a really fascinating talk and very thought-provoking. At this point, we have a number of questions in the Q&A and a couple of interesting ones in the chat as well. So maybe we can deal with a couple of the simpler ones first and then get on to the deeper ones. It's up to you. So this first one is asking, what do you think of IRC as a social network? It already exists.
Sure, it does already exist. And it's interesting the ways in which people keep reinventing IRC as Slack. You can argue that there's a version of Clubhouse, which is in some ways a reinvention of IRC based around voice. I think there's a lot to be learned from some of these older protocols. I think in many cases, what we need to think about is they are often not fit for purpose for contemporary audiences who have very different needs in sort of accessing them. What I do like about IRC is really two things. One is that whoever is opening a channel is responsible for sort of governing it and deciding what is suitable and what is unsuitable behavior. And the distributed architecture makes it such that you really do have that sort of meaningful control. I also think the idea that it's a de minimis protocol, it tries to be open to, the lowest end user. I think there's a ton to be said for that. I think, though, that we're really living in a generation of people who've grown up on things that look a little bit more like Facebook and Twitter. So many of the experiments that I'm starting with start from Mastodon, which is an open source Twitter alternative. And we are hacking it a little bit in a branch that we've been informally calling Locadon. We've been trying to build networks that could work really well along with public meetings, some of the work that Nargis Mahar is doing, that could work really well with regional newspapers. I think that's going to be a jumping off point. But I am always fascinated to think about protocols like IRC that have lasted for a very, very long time.
Great. I thought that would be a short one, but there you go. Here, maybe this one really is short. Does Gobo have a tool to sort out the online bots from real people?
No, and the funny thing is, you don't always want to sort out the bots. In some cases, bots actually are pretty interesting. There's people who consciously subscribe to bots. But as far as this question of whether Gobo is facing the misinformation problem, no, I actually think that's probably Twitter's responsibility. There's very good tools out there that are offering thoughts on whether something is automated and doing automated disinformation. We are not doing that sort of discriminatory work. Mostly what we're doing is giving people tools to help them sort of filter based on the content. We have not put bot detection in there, mostly because it's actually something that's best done when you have the view of the whole network, which leads me to think that it's something that should probably be Twitter's responsibility rather than a client responsibility.
Okay. Since you mentioned Nargis, she has a question for you. She's asking, how should we redesign social media in a new way? You've talked about sort of the structure thing, but I think she's more interested in how do we help people feel connected and help them go beyond shallow interactions? What are the first few things you would change in the?
Yeah. So first of all, for people who don't know, Nargis is a scholar in CICS. She's one of the leaders in sort of building out our new practice around human-computer interface. She's someone who's done really wonderful experimentation around how you make tools for civic participation easier to use, and her work is really brilliant, and she's one of the reasons that I chose to come to UMass. So I hope you will familiarize yourself with her work as well. Nargis, one of the ideas that I'm very interested in is this notion of something that architects talk about in designing public spaces, which is scales of intimacy. When you see people design parks, they design spaces for a whole lot of people to be together, and then for a smaller group of people to be together, and then for 2 or 3 people to be together and have a very small conversation. I think one of the things that we've done very little of in thinking about online conversational spaces is think about those sort of architectural cues. How do we make a space feel smaller and intimate and safe? How do we sort of communicate what those norms and practices are going to be for that space? I am trying to learn right now from spaces that are making very conscious choices to have certain types of interactions. So I'm studying things like Front Porch Forum, which in Vermont has gone a long way towards having very civil, very friendly discussion lists and trying to figure out what those affordances are. But I think there's a lot of cues from physical architecture that we can actually learn a great deal from.
Great. Absolutely. Wonderful. Richard Perkins asks, do you consider the First Amendment that seems to give people the right to lie at will to be a big part of the problem with social media today? And what, if so, what can be done about it?
Yeah, I think maybe you're putting the blame in the wrong place, Richard. And I don't mean on the First Amendment, although, you know, it's always worth it to have the reminder that the First Amendment starts with Congress shall make no laws, right? You know, Facebook can make whatever laws it wants about banning lying or systematic misinformation. But what I think is actually much harder is that I think we're starting to see the limits of strategies that are trying to temper mis and disinformation. I think the truth is in 2016, there was a lot of panic that the US election was being influenced by foreign mis and disinformation. In 2020, the call was coming from within the House. It was a central strategy of Donald Trump to repeat and sell the big lie, the idea that the election was stolen. Once you have one of two political parties committing in a big way towards misinformation, it's very, very hard for your information tools alone to deal with that. So what I'm going to suggest is that that's really at the point where it's becoming a political problem. It doesn't mean that Facebook and others don't have a role to play within it. But one of the things I think we actually have to be very careful of is trying to solve our political and social problems purely through technological means. The two are related to one another, but it's a mistake to try to use a technological silver bullet to solve a really thorny political problem. And this question of conflicting realities gets pretty thorny. Can I take one of these real quick?
Sure.
So Adil asks about BlueSky, Twitter's decentralized social networking effort. One of the interesting things about BlueSky, Adil, is that what they're actually doing right now is inviting proposals from a whole bunch of people. I'm actually working with a team at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard on some principles that might be part of a similar sort of networking effort. But I think there's going to be a lot of them in there. The idea of Twitter supporting an open protocol is very exciting. I would say that Twitter in general has actually been the platform that's been easiest to interact with and easiest to build around. So if anyone's going to do it, it would be Twitter. I think what's tricky is that right now there is no BlueSky proposal. There's sort of a process for taking many proposals, and it's a process that I'm participating in and watching closely. I'm supportive of it, but there's nothing yet to sort of sign off of and say, yes, this is the way to go, or not quite yet.
King Sung has a question on how closely Gobo, WT Social, and Solid are working together. It seems like having these collaborations might be a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the big things that I'm trying to do with UMass is sort of inviting people who are involved in this conversation to use this as a convener. Someone previously, either in the comment thread or in the Q&A tool, you know, sort of asked what can a land-grant university do around this? And the answer is, we're a land-grant university with a phenomenally good computer science and information school, with a school of public policy that is punching above its weight, with an utterly magnificent economics department, with a very strong comms department. We actually have a ton of the tools that you would want to have to be a convener around a topic like this one. The other thing is, if you're going to have discussions about social networks as being a public good, doing it at a public university is the right place to do it, right? It's a little embarrassing to have a conversation about public goods at these fine private universities like MIT and Stanford. This is exactly where we should be having a conversation about this. And that had a lot to do with why I came here. Both the quality of the departments that I get to work with and the fact that we're doing this from the perspective of a public university. On that question of, are we talking to each other? We are. Actually, one of the ways that we're talking to each other is through a podcast that I've been running for the year that I've been here. It's called Reimagining the Internet. If you want to hear more about these topics, you can subscribe to it. I've actually interviewed Jimmy Wales about WT Social, and I've talked to one of the chief architects of Solid. That podcast goes up in a week or two, so you can hear the sorts of conversations that we're having. We're also going to start doing convenings around this. There's going to be a first one virtually in May between UMass and the Knight First Amendment Center at Columbia, so we'll be collaborating around that. But I sincerely believe that we're going to be one of the centers of gravity around this particular approach to reimagining the net.
Very glad to hear that personally. Holly Martin is asking, how will we create, or how will the creation of these new types of social media networks help curb fake news and the rising movements of radical groups and conspiracy theory propagation?
Holly, it's a great question. And let me start by saying that the proposal that I'm putting together is not specifically intended to take that on. And there's reasons to believe that the strategies that I'm taking can make it worse as well as potentially make it better. On the make it worse side, yeah, I'm absolutely saying that people are going to start networks that are going to be all neo-Nazis all the time. And I would note that unfortunately these networks exist, right? Stormfront, continues to be an active neo-Nazi site, hosted in the United States, been up through all of these discussions we've been having about Gab and Parler and all of that. And absolutely, there are ways in which this architecture can support those things. The truth is, there's two things that this architecture helps with. One is scale. So it makes it a lot harder to stumble from innocuous content into dangerous content, the way that people seem to be doing a lot on YouTube right now. Instead, what's happening is you're in a community that has clearly stated rules of the road and that people are taking responsibility for enforcing those. And then if you don't want to be in that community, you choose to participate in a different community. The second piece of that is that people are going to be interacting with a whole bunch of different communities. And the hope is that some of the people who are getting pulled into these echo chambers are also still part of networks that are healthier in some ways. And the hope is that these healthier networks are helping counterbalance some of that mis and disinformation. But to be really clear, I am getting to the point on the mis and disinformation question where I'm very worried that we can't just solve it informationally. I think we're going to have to take on some of the political implications of it as well. And what I'm really looking for is sort of a long strategy of helping people become better citizens through this hard work of participating in these communities and learning how to be part of these conversations.
These are hard. These are really tough questions. You've got a couple of questions that are on the really around how do we help, right?
Yeah. So there's a question.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's a question from Pashem, and I'm going to try to take that one offline. I don't know the protocol, and I would love to. So Pashem, let's make sure that we talk about that. Dara raises this question about how Clubhouse can succeed. Clubhouse is this quite new audio-based social network. I'm excited about Clubhouse as well. I am a little worried in that they don't seem to be making very wise decisions so far about privacy or about user control. There is some benefit in that it is a little bit like IRC. You get to sort of moderate and run your own space. The fact that it's voice chat basically makes it very, very hard for anyone to do real-time filtering. And there clearly are some very exciting things that have happened. A friend of mine wrote a lovely little article that I taught in my class about just how strong Clubhouse has been for pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong, sort of having discussions with mainland Chinese. So we'll see where that goes, but there's definitely some governance concerns. Paul asked this question about whether social media users can combat misinformation. I think one of the biggest things that I would say is I don't think misinformation is as much a technical problem as a social problem. And I do think that gently calling out misinformation and sort of asking people where they're getting their news, pointing people to other news, I think those are all things that can be very effective up to a point. I do think that we're starting to see with movements like QAnon, it's getting quite hard to challenge people's beliefs. We are getting sort of very tribal into camps. I think there's good technological work that's helping people suss out the facts. I think what gets really challenging is that what we want a Facebook or someone else to be doing? And I think those are the sorts of governance questions that are going to be pretty central to some of these sort of small, local, smaller scale social networks that I'm talking about.
Great. We're running out of time and we've got a ton of questions.
Great questions, yeah.
They're wonderful. And unfortunately, we do have a hardest stop. So I think
why don't you pick out one or two that you like? There's a few of these that I think are really nice. I think Charlotte's is great.
That was going to be one of my choices, because I think Charlotte's gets to the heart of what your approach is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So before I take on Charlotte's question, let me just sort of say, first of all, if you're not getting an answer from me and you want to keep talking, you can tweet at me at EthanZ. You can email me ethanz@umass.edu. I'm still a little buried in email from Tuesday's talk, so it might take until like early next week, but go for it. I'm really happy to continue the conversation. Charlotte asked this question: is it more or less of a public good to have a few main platforms or to have an excess of platform options? I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't believe it was a public good. I think the problem in some ways is that the platforms are not public spaces. They're like having a conversation in a shopping mall. It's possible to do, but it's not the best place to hold a political rally because, of course, they can shut it down. And also its real goal is to get you to buy, not necessarily to get you to have a conversation. The argument for a few platforms is that if you just have a few platforms, Facebook has a lot more resources than I do. Maybe they can do a better job of solving the mis and disinformation problem than I can do with my little lab at UMass. I think the counter to that is that they're not doing great so far, and that it's really hard to steer a ship as big as Facebook. One thing I've actually had great success with is just making small interventions and watching platforms adopt them. So the Gobo tool makes it very transparent why something is in or not in your feed, why it got filtered in or out. And we introduced that and wrote about it. And 3 months later, Facebook introduced it. Do I know that they took it from Gobo? No. Does it seem plausible? Sure. Is it a nice way of trying to figure out how to influence, a battleship when you're just a PT boat? Yeah, that seems like a good way to work. So that's part of why I'm choosing to work this way. Let's let Matt close out with this question. Was there ever a moment in time when the internet was a force for bringing the public together rather than fragmenting us? And I'm going to say, yeah, I think so. And I still think there are many moments that the internet has enormous social good. I think the internet is enormously important for people's voices that were not widely heard before. We haven't talked about it, but one of the biggest projects I've worked on in my career is called Global Voices. And it's a network that just tries to amplify perspectives and voices from the developing world. I think we've seen the internet be incredibly powerful for social movements. I just got to interview Charlton McElwain, who wrote a great book called Black Software, who looks at how the Black Lives Matter movement comes almost entirely out of Black Twitter. That's going to be on the Reimagining the Internet feed. People who are exploring different gender identities, people who are queer and growing up in small communities, all these publics have been really, really powerful for different people over time. I think what's become so challenging is that there's this really complex relationship between the platforms, mainstream media, and contemporary politics that clearly is not working very well for anyone. That's the sort of confusing nexus that I'm interested in hacking and sort of trying some new experiments around.
This has been a great discussion. I wish we could answer all the wonderful questions that are waiting, but we are up on time here. I know Ethan has things to do and all of you busy people do too. So for those who missed it in the chat, I just want to reiterate that we will be posting the recordings to our YouTube channel, and links will be sent out to all the registrants for either or both. Links to both recordings for both sessions will be sent out to everybody who registered for any of those. We hope that you will have a chance to view whatever you missed. And as Ethan said, feel free to reach out. So thank you all for coming, and thank you very much, Ethan, for a fascinating discussion.
Absolutely, and thank you, Laura, for having me, and thanks to the UMass community for just making me so welcome. It's really wonderful to be part of this group, and I'm really looking forward to spending a long and fruitful time here.
Great, excellent.